Hi there and welcome to the video. I'm your host John Ivison. This week I'm talking with Dominic Cardy, who is the interim leader of Canada's newest political party, the Canadian Future Party. Dominic, welcome.
Hi John, thanks for having me on the show. Really appreciate it.
So for those who may not have followed your progress, you are a member of the Legislative Assembly in New Brunswick. You served as Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development. Prior to that, you were leader of the New Brunswick NDP, which I guess illustrates that this is not a party of a dogmatic nature, perhaps. Latterly, you've been working on this new party, but it hasn't just arrived out of thin air. I think a lot of smart people have been working on it for quite a while. Could you just give us a bit of background?
Sure thing. Yeah, so it started off with, so the new party, Canadian Future, evolved from a group called Centre-Ice Canadians, which in turn evolved from a group called Centre-Ice Conservatives that was born in the heat of the Tory leadership race in 2022, when we saw the race between Mr. Charest and Mr. Poilievre. And a lot of us were, although we supported Mr. Charest, still think, where is the new politics here? Where are the champions of the issues that we're going to have to confront as politicians and as a country over the next 10 or 20 years. And obviously with Mr. Poilievre's victory, with 85% of the folks who voted for him having never been a member of the Conservative Party before, we could see that this was the beginning of a new populist age in Canadian politics, similar to the one that Mr. Trump ushered in the US when he brought in lots of people who had never voted before. Regardless, so we had this group, we were talking about how can we try and push politics a little bit back towards evidence-based and moderation, which sometimes gets translated as centrist, although that word can, I think, have a little bit of a negative connotation. It sounds sort of wishy-washy. We're not talking about being sort of a flabby party with stealing a little bit from the left and right. We're trying to talk about doing things very differently. So I was trying to say this is centrism as in the center of the arrow, the tip of the arrow, rather than anything wishy-washy. So Centre-Ice then evolved into Centre-Ice Canadians because we had lots of Liberals and NDPers who said that they felt the same about their party, that they were increasingly feeling excluded, that the parties didn't reflect their values, were becoming more extreme. A lot of concern about the role of social media being a driver of this as parties abandoned face-to-face organizing and reaching out to build coalitions and instead replace that with seeking online engagement and clickbait, which works, but has the unfortunate side effect of ripping our society apart. So,
well, let's come back to some of the policy and positioning on the political spectrum. Just more practically, how are things likely to unfold as far as a permanent leader, members voting on policy? How many MPs are you planning to run if an election is 2 years away, for example?
So we had with Centre-Ice Canadians, which was we had hoped would be a pressure group to try and influence the other parties, but very quickly realized that, again, the other parties were paying much more attention to Facebook algorithms than they were to things that Canadians were genuinely interested in. We realized that going for a party was probably going to be a necessary step. To try and make sure we had some connection between public will and the voice of this new party, over the course of the summer we put together a policy framework, encouraged people who were involved in the Centre-Ice Canadians movement, which was several thousand people, to go through a fairly rigorous process to come up with policies, not just saying, we'd like to do X, but why should government do this? How much is it going to cost? What are the arguments against doing this? Why wouldn't the private sector or nonprofit groups be better placed to pursue this policy? And we got some very good ideas, which I'm hoping we can chat about a little bit. But those ideas, again, give us sort of the basis for this new party on the interim period as we go through what I would expect to be a year-long process of starting last week. We announced the party was going to be formed. We're now going through the process with Elections Canada. We have to have 250 founding members, bylaws that define how money is raised and spent, the usual sort of accountability mechanisms that are entirely appropriate, but just take some time. The last step in that process is a candidate from Canadian Future standing in either a by-election or a general election, and at that point, Elections Canada sort of give you the sign-off and say you're now a full-fledged party. We then hope from the party side to prepare for a convention I would expect around this time next year, the usual convention season, and that convention will either set the rules for a leadership race or announce the election of a new leader, depending on whether we've had the time to build the organization up to that level. And we have a national council with reps from each province and territory, and that will be making those decisions on an interim basis, with as many new ideas for reaching out to members as we can use, because although social media has been a massively negative force in a large number of ways, it does offer incredible opportunities to engage with people. And we also want to use face-to-face meetings, try and see if we can go back to remembering that human beings are social animals and actually sitting in the same room, looking at each other in the eyes, not just through the mediation of a little light on a computer screen, is something that's good for people and can lead to good politics. It gave us the system we have now, which is the best that the world's ever seen. Let's see if we can make it better.
Agreed. So let's get into some of the weeds. One of the smart people who have been participating in your party, veteran backroom operator Rick Anderson, a good friend of the show, said on your website that he believes Canadians value principled pragmatism over dogmatic ideology, and I agree with that. But at the same time, other smart people, Dan Robertson, who was the Conservative Party's chief strategist in 2021, says he doesn't believe that the new party is serving any market, that the fiscally conservative, socially liberal vote does not really exist in any great numbers. How do you respond to that?
Well, it's a note that there's a little bit of a conflict there given his position within the Conservative Party. But setting that aside, we did a poll earlier this year to see whether we were out to lunch on this, because if we're going to be evidence-based, then starting a party that flies against the face of evidence wouldn't make much sense. That poll showed very clearly that a majority of not just Canadians, but liberal and conservative supporters believed their parties were becoming more extreme, showed a strong level of support for fiscal responsibility and social liberalism. So the numbers are there. The problem is right now is that those folks are spread across all the different political parties. So you've got supposed blue liberals, red Tories, Blairist New Democrats, not very many of those left. But still, there is a chunk across the spectrum of people who do have that belief in a government that can absolutely deliver strong and well-managed social programs, but that doesn't have to be a slippery slope to statism. And similarly, you can embrace the private sector and competition and all the good things that can bring without a free market free-for-all or the takeover of politics by moneyed interests as you see in the United States. So there is, according to all the evidence, and if you look in lots of the other publicly available polls, it says the same thing. This does appear to be a large and unserved market. And the evidence I would cite, anecdotal, yes, but this is the project we're talking about. Since last week, I was expecting to maybe do a couple of interviews about this. A small group of people headed by an MLA from New Brunswick putting out a press release saying we are going to start a new party. I've been doing interviews solidly since last Wednesday morning. We've had thousands and thousands of emails, nearly all of them very, very positive. Dozens of people saying they want to stand as candidates, get involved, give money, which we can't accept yet because of Elections Canada. We have to go through that process. So who knows? We will see what happens. And in the end, the great thing in democracy is that elections tell the truth. We'll find out what the appetite is for this project. First, if we can get it off the ground, run it properly. And then in an election, if Canadians decide they like what they see. My job is to try and just guide that process.
Another response came from Stockwell Day, the former Canadian Alliance leader, who said you are the answer to Justin Trudeau's prayers in that you will never form government, but you'll take the Conservative Party back to the years of the Reform Conservative splits, allowing the Liberals to win. How do you respond to that?
Well, the great thing with this is the Conservatives who somehow think that we are sitting here trying to split their vote. The poll that we did and all the other polls out there show that there's a fairly even support for an option like this. That there are lots of Conservatives who are horrified at the conspiracy-driven direction that Mr. Poilievre has taken the party, and the waffling on about the World Economic Forum and other things that blame shadowy outside forces for what's happening in Canada. Really, to my mind, abandoning the agency of Canadians and controlling our own country's future by outsourcing everything that's wrong to George Soros or the WEF or what have you. And on the Liberal side, a lot of people very tired with totally uncontrolled spending without any apparent interest in results or processes for managing government programs. So Justin Trudeau, I think, has been the absolutely perfect foil for Mr. Poilievre. The problem is that Mr. Poilievre is asking a lot of good questions of Mr. Trudeau, but the answers he's proposing are either evasive or actively dangerous. So to Mr. Day's point, I do not want to see Mr. Poilievre in 24 Sussex Drive or wherever we decide to house our prime ministers in the future, as much as I don't want to see Mr. Trudeau, because I believe both of them are two sides of the same rather tired coin, proposing ideas that do not work. uncontrolled spending wrapped up in a cloak of virtue on Mr. Trudeau's side, and a dangerous appeal to conspiracy theorizing and an embrace of the further Americanizing of our politics. So we're pushing back and saying we need a civic Canadian nationalism that talks about Canadian problems and Canadian solutions to those problems, does not outsource blame to anyone else, says we are in charge of our country. And we need to aggressively tackle a whole range of problems that neither the Liberals or the Conservatives have even begun talking about. So that's the goal here, is not to try and hive off a few votes from one side or the other. The goal is to try and change the political discussion.
Well, talking about policy, you authored the policy statement, at the end of which you said, there you have it, policies that you won't hear from existing parties. To my mind, though, there was very little there that sounded new or bold. A simplified tax code, mixed member PRs, speeding up accreditation for foreign healthcare workers, increasing military spending to 2% of GDP. I mean, the Conservatives are pushing for most of those things, aren't they?
I certainly have not heard Liberals or Conservatives talking about a national civil defence corps that would introduce a level of national service to Canadians. I have not heard the Liberals or Conservatives talk about introducing a mixed member proportional election system. Of course, we had the Liberals' failed promise around changing the electoral system. We're talking about a specific model, introducing it through legislation, done. Certainly have not heard the Liberals or Conservatives talking about aggressively tackling climate change through building nuclear reactors and putting a real focus on investing profits from overseas sales of CANDO and other technologies to countries, taking those profits, reinvesting them in a green transition here at home. We've had the Conservatives who pretend climate change doesn't exist, and the Liberals who think that, as with most other problems, that this is an issue that can simply be solved by flinging money at it. Our belief is that we can unleash the power of the private sector to drive innovation. I'm a pilot in my life outside of politics, and look back to the golden age of aviation in the 1920s. You had government and private sector philanthropists who would give $1 million prizes to people if they would achieve the next big goal in breaking down the frontiers in aviation, the first flight across the Atlantic, flights across North America, etc. There's no reason we can't engage that sort of innovative spirit today, especially when we see some of the most interesting ideas around tackling climate change being pursued by high school kids working with friends around their computer. So again, to your point, even the policies you listed, forget about some of the other ones on there. I don't see the Liberals or Conservatives doing it. The Conservatives have been very coy about what they're going to do on defense. And as for simplifying the tax code, we're talking about going back to Trudeau Senior's idea of having a full-on commission to radically simplify the tax code as a way of allowing us to save a lot of money, hopefully reduce taxes, and give us more money to invest in other programs. That's, again, I'm not hearing, so unless I've been misreading the press releases and platform statements, I haven't heard any parties making any of those commitments under any circumstances, and especially not our central issue, which is going to transform Canada in a way that would allow us to be prepared for this next big shift internationally. We're talking about an aggressive decoupling from China, from its economy and from its politics. And I think that's something which we have to wake up in Canada and recognize the real dangers that dictatorships are posing to our country. Russia trying to influence our online discussions that has an immediate effect on our real life politics, and the Chinese who are continuing their efforts to exert economic control over our country, which is now bleeding into political control.
You mentioned climate change. Do you support a consumer carbon tax?
I would prefer to see us move to something where the polluters pay directly, more of a cap and trade, but that is something where we haven't set on the final policy. So we will have discussions over that. If there's an election next year, the interim group will make a call on which policy to adopt. My hope is that can be a couple of options discussed at the first convention of the party. But there will be a plan to deal with climate change on the basis of it being a crisis that has to be addressed within 10 years.
Now, I'm somewhat playing devil's advocate here by saying that your policies are too similar to the other parties. I've been writing about this for a few years. Early 2021, I remember saying that I felt that there was room in the political spectrum for a new centre-right party because the progressives and populists were hurtling in opposite directions. The Post subsequently commissioned a poll and found that nearly 6 in 10 people felt politically homeless. Since then, though, Pierre Poilievre has become the Conservative leader. He seems to have mellowed the brand a little bit of the angry populism that got him elected. And he seems to have convinced many people that they can live with him as a potential Prime Minister. Do you think you've missed your window?
I don't know. I would not expect so, because I think what we're seeing now is fatigue with Justin Trudeau. If you look at some of those same polls, we see a significant uptick in numbers for the Bloc in Quebec, for example. So I think in many cases it's looking for an alternative. And the Trudeau Liberals are seen as being increasingly tired and out of ideas and making a series of mistakes that I think are causing embarrassment for the country. It's not a huge surprise. Lots of governments after 8 years in power start to behave that way. So not to pick on them too much, but for that, on that at least. But when it comes to Mr. Poilievre, he's going around campaigning, as he did in the recent Manitoba by-election, to the right of Max Bernier's People's Party, accusing the Bernier Party of being somehow in league with globalists and all this other foolishness that I think, as you well know, is dog whistling for anti-Semitic rubbish that's been circulated by extremists for decades. And I think that is incredibly dangerous. I spent years of my life working on democracy promotion in developing countries. And the dangers of social media amplified populism cannot be understated. And either Mr. Poilievre knows what he's doing, in which case shame on him, or he doesn't, in which case shame on Canadians if we fall for this. So my hope is that we can make it very clear what Mr. Poilievre is offering, hopefully pin him down a bit. If they end up by trying to further mellow themselves because they see a threat from the center, which I assume is why we've got so many Conservative Party commentators over the last week spending a great deal of effort talking about how totally irrelevant the Canadian Future Party is and how no one should spend any time talking about it. So that's why they're going to write yet another op-ed about how terrible and awful and what a waste of time this is. That I think we struck a bit of a nerve. This is a risk to Mr. Poilievre's strategy, which is to pretend that he hasn't recruited a lot of very extreme people. Yeah. Roman Barber, who ran for the CPC leadership, who was kicked out of Doug Ford's caucus for being an extremist, is now welcomed in the CPC ranks. Dr. Leslyn Lewis, who spent her leadership campaign running against Mr. Poilievre, trying to out-campaign him to the populist right, spreading utterly deluded conspiracy theories about a whole range of things, from vaccines to Russia to others. She's now welcomed on the front bench of that party. There's a danger here. And I'm focusing right now on the CPC because you asked me. The Liberals deserve blame for this because they've opened the space up through a politics that has been so utterly vapid that it's made defending institutions look like the wrong thing to do. And it's made it easy for Mr. Poilievre to campaign on this Canada is broken rubbish, which I think is, again, absolutely, in addition to being wrong, it's also deeply insulting to Canadians.
Well, you mentioned, I asked you about the Conservatives, so let me ask you about the Liberals. I mean, it seems to me that the particular brand of liberalism that Justin Trudeau promotes is about tilting the field to achieve equity. It's about equality of outcomes, not equality of opportunities. It's about group rights, not individual rights. Do you think people are fed up with the inevitable conflicts that produces?
I think so. I think that there's absolutely a tiredness there, especially because it's all so hollow and it doesn't deliver. You look at, if you talk about his stated goals, which I don't think he's ever put them as clearly as you did, which is sort of a Trudeau specialty, but I'm sure he did it with nice socks, that when he talks about these changes, he's been in government now for 8 years and there is no change. We have a housing crisis. We have absolutely had a few positive things. I would highlight as education minister working with the feds on the early childhood development plan. That's something that the evidence is very clear. You've got good early childhood education. You massively improve outcomes for people. That program wasn't properly resourced. And rather than continuing to invest in that, they go on to the next headline-grabbing press release and announce a dental plan that largely overlaps with already existing provincial plans. So that confusion with policy outcomes and good press announcements, I think, is something that's contributed enormously to the cynicism of Canadians. And you have a government that I think is trapped in the 1990s. And you can see that with their response to Mr. Poilievre's convention speech, which scared the life out of me. And what do the Liberals think that the best response to someone preaching a 21st century brand of populism is? They go and roll out video clips of Jean Charest. I mean, this is a battle between the 1990s and the 1930s in terms of the political parties that we're talking about dominating the Canadian political sphere. Neither have got anything to say about the challenges that are coming. And you went back to, again, saying Liberals and Tories, where are our policies different? Where are the Liberals and Tories in talking about, for example, social media algorithms? We have the pointless fight with Meta over Canadian news, but nothing that actually got into the heart of the issue of why social media is risky, not because it threatens Canadian media ownership, but because the algorithms threaten Canadian society. And you might have read Max Fisher's book, The Chaos Machine, where he talks about the way in which the algorithms, which didn't even exist in the social media companies and the platforms we're used to 10 years ago, they were introduced and have taken on a life of their own, and they live and thrive off of generating content through conflict and extremism and promoting division. And they make money off of that. And our parties, rather than standing up against that and saying, why don't we have regulations about what's in an algorithm? Why don't we make it so that you have to opt in to a social media platform's algorithm as a conscious choice? Yes, you might get stuff that's more tailored, but then you accept that you're walking into these dangerous waters where the currents of the platform will drive you towards more extreme content.
But having said that, though, obviously we live in the age of the algorithm. That means being deliberately polarizing to attract attention. So you will avoid being polarizing, and then you risk being ignored, don't you?
We do, yeah. And that's absolutely. So one of the things we're focusing on is face-to-face organizing. We're going to go out and actually have meetings with Canadians in communities, because there is, beyond the day-to-day politics and the issues that, some of which are going to dominate our politics for the next generation, the war in Ukraine, the issues with China, but there are lots of others that will slide away, either be dealt with properly or not. But we're totally ignoring this huge transformation to our species that the internet has wrought, and the way in which humans organize themselves and interact with each other, the way in which people are now part of online communities that may have nothing to do with where they actually live. And the degradation of solidarity in communities, or because of that, is a real risk. And we're seeing that in country after country. So given we have this evidence body of evidence that's being built up, surely it's responsible for any political party trying to run this country to talk about how Canadians are going to be made aware of these issues and offer some options about how to control them, how to mitigate the damage, and how to maximize the benefits, because the internet and social media can also bring huge and positive transformations as well. I was in Tunisia just after their revolution 10 or so years ago, and there were signs up, people were graffitiing "Thank you, Facebook" on all the walls. Since then, Facebook has equally been used to weaponize Buddhist extremism in Myanmar and cause multiple massacres. Same in a few other countries. So it's a tool, but we've acted as though it's a tool that doesn't need oversight or any sort of control. And it's probably part because we're all part of this species-wide social experiment of living with the internet and social media. But again, that AI, where are our main parties in talking about this? We're all spending our lives in the phones, and in government we act as though they don't exist.
Just to finish up, I did appreciate that you said that government should not be involved in the private lives of citizens. Your policy was basically that's it. This likely won't win you votes because people don't talk in these terms. But in ideological terms, do you see yourselves as heirs to the classical liberals, promoting compassion, open markets, limited government, equality of opportunity, individual rights, and surrounded by bullies and councillors and populists?
That is absolutely where we see ourselves. We see ourselves as holding on to, I think, an updated 21st century version of small L classical liberalism, where we acknowledge that this incredibly complex society we've built, which has emerged over the last 100 years, we act as though it's been around forever, this incredibly fragile web of institutions, both public and private, services provided to people. These are delicate and need to be carefully looked after. But if we forget the purpose of them, which is to serve the public, that's why we have our public services, then we really risk what we're seeing right now, which is people feeling increasingly alienated from the institutions that are part of our lives and the politicians who manage them. And that allows populists to claim that somehow there's this shadowy group, this elite that's controlling things behind the scenes. And that leads to social breakdown. And we've seen that in country after country. And it would be a tragedy if we took Canada as one of the world's longest, most well-established and strongest democracies and abandoned that tradition because we couldn't figure out how to manage things in the short term. So our hope is that we can try and push the conversation back towards dealing with some of those longer term challenges. Counter the cynicism also by running this party the way that we would run a government if we were given the honor of doing that, making sure that we're transparent, clear, open. We'll have everything that we possibly can available on our website as we make decisions, financial logs, all those sorts of things, and see if we can just get back to having a bit of a conversation based on reality saying that, look, if you're going to talk in terms of conspiracies, we're not interested. But if you're willing to operate within the sandbox of a small L liberal democracy, the rule of law, regular and free elections, an independent judiciary, then we should be more tolerant of each other and figure out that the slightly to the left, slightly to the right opinion maybe isn't as evil as we would like to present it to be in pursuit of social media clicks, and see if we can actually get back to working together again. And if that project works, fantastic. If it doesn't, that's up to Canadians to decide. But it seemed like a necessary project, and that's why I'm putting my time into it. And apparently thousands of Canadians are ready to do the same. So we'll see what happens.
Well, Dominic, thank you very much for your time. We will be monitoring the future of the Canadian Future Party with interest. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Great.